Nostalgia Trappers. Welcome to the program. David Parsons here. Hope you're doing well. Hope you're ready for another shot of one of my absolute favorite guests on this program, Yasmin Nair. We talked with Yasmin a few weeks ago. We did a two-part series on death and grief as we tried to wrap our minds around the fact that millions of people have died from a global pandemic, and none of us have any real way of processing that, and that probably explains why everything's all fucked up these days. So check out that two-part series if you want to go down that rabbit hole. But I wanted to talk to Yasmin again about the idea of trauma, particularly this idea of like the political efficacy of trauma, of like sharing our stories of sadness and suffering in order to maybe like, I don't know, have an effect or get something from it. Yasmin has this piece up on her website. If you haven't checked out her website, you need to, yasminnair.com. She's got this piece up called AOC and the Weaponization of Trauma. It's about AOC and her response to the Capitol riot and insurrection on January 6th. In these two Instagram videos that AOC made, both of them engaging ideas of national and personal trauma and how those things might be related. Really, really key stuff. And what Yasmin does with this piece is sort of analyze those videos, but also talk about this larger idea of trauma and sharing our trauma and our graphic, violent suffering as a way of moving political culture in one way or another. Let me read a really brief excerpt from this piece because I think it'll tell you a little bit of where we're going with this episode. Here's Yasmin. Women of color and other minorities are frequently called upon to retell and vomit out their narratives of trauma simply in order to legitimize themselves and to make themselves legible in the public eye or in myriad settings, including professional ones. Grant applicants must not only provide some evidence that they are in fact members of marginalized communities, but also provide at least one story about how they have overcome hardships. The proof of their identity is inextricably bound up with the trauma stories they're required to cough up. Applicants for asylum or refugee status go through an onerous process and are often denied admission because they don't seem traumatized enough, and the not enough is subjectively defined by the presiding judge. The process can be psychologically brutalizing because the system requires them to not only repeat over and over their traumatic and traumatizing stories, but to make sure that they ratchet up every evidence of trauma. If you want your supper, the logic goes, you must sing of your suffering and woe. So that idea, links up a little bit with the conversation we had with Bertrand Cooper a few months ago about his piece in Current Affairs. That was sort of about how this is tied to race and class and gender. This notion that suffering is a sort of ontological element of that experience, and the suffering is how you identify yourself as part of that group. That's a problem, and I think it is tied pretty strongly to this notion of none of us having any way to deal with the trauma and grief and death that's happened during COVID. There is a relationship to those two things. And I think that part of that is what we wanted to get at in this conversation. So this is a complicated, nuanced conversation, but I had a lot of fun with Yasmin because she's someone who I feel like can take the conversation anywhere. She's a very adventurous thinker. So I hope you enjoy this and enjoy all our Nostalgia Trap stuff. You can check all of it out at nostalgiatrap.com. And if you want to join our subscription service, that's at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. Lots of bonus stuff for our subscribers, including our new movie club, which is starting up November 19th, Friday, November 19th. Check out our Patreon for details on that. We're going to be watching the movie The Night of the Hunter and talking about film noir as a genre. Very excited to get going with the movie club and talk to the Nostalgia Trap folks. So join that if you want. If you're a cinema person, I'll be looking forward to talking to you then. All right, I hope you enjoy this episode. Here is me and Yasmin Nair talking about trauma. All right, Yasmin, great to see you. How you doing?
I'm well, thank you. Excited to be here today.
Yeah, we were talking about death and grief last time you and I spoke, and got a lot of great reactions to that episode. People had a lot to say about it. I think it's something that people are sort of itching to talk about. So I wanted to keep the ball rolling and talk about trauma today. And when I wrote you about this, you said I'm the trauma girl, and I realized that you've written a lot on this subject. When did trauma is, I mean, for a hint of where we're going with this, part of what you write about, I think, is sort of like the political efficacy of trauma as a framework for moving people and for being a part of our politics. And you have a number of really great pieces on this that I'll link to in the episode description. But one of them that stuck out to me is AOC and the weaponization of trauma, which is sort of about what happened on January 6th, which, I mean, people are still kind of mulling over what happened on January 6th at the Capitol, and AOC's like very particular response to it through a series of Instagram live videos and stuff like that. It's a really nuanced piece, and I urge everyone to go read it because it I think tackles something that I think is a really important part, especially the left, like how the left invokes trauma as some sort of like a badge of honor or necessary sort of part of, especially like minorities, like women, gay people, people of color. We had Bertrand Cooper on a few months ago talking about this, saying that like basically you're not black enough if you haven't like proved that you were like, raised in the ghetto and beat up by a white cop, and all those experiences meant to like prove a sort of authenticity. When did you start noticing this? Because I feel like it's a kind of a long trajectory.
It is. No, it is a long trajectory. And it's really interesting that you should point to the fact that this is something that the left has been developing for years, and which is actually what began my thoughts on the process. It all began for me. I was thinking about this, yesterday, trying to think, when did I begin to think and problematize trauma? And it all really, I think, began for me when I found myself at various, lots of these panels. I'm part of the queer, radical, abolitionist, lefty community in Chicago, and a lot of amazing work, as you know, abolitionist work, queer radical work has come out of Chicago. I mean, we gave the world the 8-hour day. So, it's only natural that we should be continuing in those radical efforts. But I found myself at a lot of these panels, and sometimes on these panels as well, and noticed that all these women, and particularly women of color, felt compelled to first establish their trauma, and not only to say, I was, for instance, they would have to say something like, I am a victim of rape and assault, etc. But then they would have to somehow describe all of that as well. And I would watch these women, many of whom are still, were and are still women I really, really admire, and that they are women, of course, is important. And I would watch them do this over and over again. And I remember thinking, this is ridiculous. This is re-traumatizing. This is about a woman forced to constantly perform her victimhood, perform her trauma for what was often a largely white audience. And that was another problematic I noticed. And it occurred to me that this is what the left is doing now, especially in relation to gender and race, which is to say its way of, quote unquote, including those aspects is to say to people of color, to women, well, fine, we'll include you, but first you must perform for us. And it is, it's a nasty term to use, but I think it's accurate, that it's become a form of minstrelsy in many ways, right? So you have, and especially, and I think I'm so glad you talked about Bertrand's excellent piece in the always excellent Current Affairs, shameless plug here.
It is a really great piece, and
it's a fantastic piece.
Yeah, and we had him on to kind of explain what he means by it, and I was like, it was all about pop culture, right? Like because reading your piece on AOC and reading your other interview about the perfect neoliberal subject is like someone who's a subject of trauma. It makes sense. I was thinking about like movies and TV shows. A lot of it comes through like storytelling. Like there's like this natural impulse to like tell a story of someone going through something fucked up and then overcoming it, and that somehow became like attached to a real experience. I think about like college admissions essays, that's
Yes, I was
right?
just thinking about that yesterday too.
I
Yes.
remember, and maybe this is an older thing, because I remember whether it be in undergrad or graduate school, when I was writing those essays, I assumed that I had to write something about overcoming something, and I actually, like, I had a speech impediment when I was young. So I wrote about that, and I wrote about how hard it was, and I wrote about that not because it's like this was important to me to communicate in college. Actually, that was a distant memory to me. My speech impediment happened when I was 10 years old. I didn't care anymore. But I told the story because it felt like the story had value. And it seems like that's part of what you're getting at in your pieces.
Absolutely. And your college admissions story, yes, this is exactly what a lot of people have said. If you're white, you have to have something to compensate for that. If you're not white, your not whiteness alone becomes an impediment that they will take for granted.
Right.
But definitely if you're white, yes. And then if you happen to be a person of color and of a certain privilege, then you have to invent something. So I wrote an essay again in the famous Current Affairs about this guy you might remember, whose name I forget, but he became very famous as he was this Asian American guy. I think of his parents were of Pakistani origin, quite wealthy, or Bangladeshi, I think. But he wrote an admissions essay for Stanford. Do you remember this? Which was just the words BLM, Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter,
oh boy,
over and over again. And he got into Stanford. And then he eventually went over to Harvard.
How could he not?
How could he not?
You're going to be terrified to reject that letter. Yeah.
Right. And this guy was, I've since followed him a little bit, and he is perfectly neoliberal. And he's probably going to be the next, he's going to be another president of the United States. I have no doubt about this because he's deeply manipulative. I can send you the link for that essay as well. But it is about having, yes, if you are not attached to some trauma narrative, you simply don't count as human anymore. That's just the way it is, especially for women. And I think this is what the important thing, though, about all of this to note is that this isn't just about people wanting to understand you on a personal level. This is entirely about systems. So, for instance, all the women that I witnessed and I continue to witness, right, vomiting out their stories, of course, about trauma and so on, a lot of them are coming out of the nonprofit industrial complex, and they belong to groups and organizations which have to articulate these narratives of trauma in order to get any funding at all from often and mostly, as we know, white-led nonprofit industry. The funders are still white, right? In the nonprofit world.
It's like a form of reparations.
Yes.
That's dependent upon like the more you suffered, the more we owe you. There's something really sinister about that.
Yeah.
Because it does feel like minstrelsy. It does feel like, and you put it in, I love your writing, is you put it in very stark terms, where it's kind of like, dance for us, cry for us, and the more you cry, the more you suffer, the more we owe you something, or the more that has power. But it seems like only the left, because the right doesn't seem like they care about this, right? Like AOC discussing her trauma, which, I think you do a really great job of sort of negotiating the different ways that she uses her trauma. Because she talks about, she kind of, she sort of blurs the line between the national trauma of the 1/6 thing and her personal trauma of sexual assault. But the right just laughs at this. It's almost like the power they get from hearing trauma is like, they love it and they think it's funny. And it's not. It doesn't really have a power. So it's really for the left. And I guess that's why I like your question, because it's not a reactionary thing about AOC. It's more asking kind of like, well, what the fuck does this do for any of us?
Right. And that's what one of my friends, and I don't think I noted that they were also male. In the essay I write, one of my friends who is an ardent feminist, ardent leftist, looked at me and said, "What the hell am I supposed to do with this narrative? I mean, what am I supposed to do with it? If I ignore it, I come across as a jerk. If I critique it, which I want to, I also come off as a jerk." And I think that's the position that a lot of people on the left who may not be complicit in these narratives are left with, right? No pun intended, which is to say, we can't say no to these narratives, and we also can't, we're not really comfortable buying into them either. AOC is a fascinating case because she actually did 2 videos, right? The first video she did about what happened on the 6th was fine. It was about, this is what happened. And it was terrifying enough. I mean, first of all, you're a woman of color, you're a woman in power, and there is this horde of mostly white men bashing down the doors. You have no idea who's on your side. Even the guards, some of the guards, according to her, and I believe her, that some of the guards even seemed to not care about her safety. And she really did, I can imagine, feeling like she was going to be raped and killed.
She's the one I was most concerned with, honestly, throughout the day, because I thought she's such a target for all these different reasons you listed.
Absolutely.
And so, that narrative is terrifying without her, with her second video, which gets into her personal trauma.
Yes. And I think what happened is that there was some pushback. Again, mostly, I think, from right-wing Twitter, the Twitterati, as if that matters. And again, this is also about the Twitterization of politics, which is, when you have, I think it was the Iranian president, who resigns on Twitter, things have gone to hell, right, in the neoliberal political world. So I think what happened was she got some pushback, and then for some reason she decided, well, if you're not going to believe that this was traumatic enough, let me tell you that let me now reveal to you that I'm also a survivor of trauma. I was, she was sexually assaulted, apparently. And again, I don't disbelieve her, but it is interesting to me that a woman who clearly in her life must have experienced enough for her to feel extraordinarily fragile during this very potent few hours. I mean, that whole thing really didn't last all day, as I recall, but it's a frightening moment in time that someone like that feels that as a politician, she can't simply say this awful thing happened, that she somehow has to play to the peanut gallery, really, right? So she was playing to this Twitter crowd, really. And I thought it was just appalling. And again, but also I think what's important about the piece I wrote is to see it in relation to what AOC has revealed herself to be since then, which is, for instance, if you think about the Met Gala, and her showing up in that rather ugly dress. It wasn't ugly because of the lettering. It was just, I think friends of mine said, this is like bad bridal wear shop design. It wasn't really a design.
It looked like, David's Bridal, right?
I was just trying to remember the name of that shop. Yes, exactly. David's Bridal, right? And then if you think about her vote, recently around Israel, and she decides to vote, she just votes present, and then she cries. So there are all these pictures of her boohooing away after a really shitty vote, which she did not have to take. There were others of the squad who took much more forceful, determined positions on that issue. But she decides to take the coward's way out and then devolve into tears, right? So this is also about AOC. And I don't know where this path is going to take her. I think she's deeply manipulative. And I wanted to, and I don't mean that on a personal level. I do mean it in terms of, if we are going to move forward into a world where we actually have more women politicians and more women of color, what can and should we expect of them? That is, for me, a big question. So it's not, I absolutely, yes, have a lot of contempt for AOC as a politician. I do. Because I look at her and I think, you're a piece of shit because you devolve into tears over difficult votes. I mean, I have no patience for your crap. Right? That's my attitude, sure. But more importantly for me, it is, I want more women in politics. I want more women of color. I want more left women. I want more socialist, Marxist women in positions of power, right? And what can I say is the template for that?
Yeah.
I don't want it to be AOC. And I think that for me is a big question. And that I think is a connection between trauma and larger systems of politics, larger systems of entertainment, for instance, and how we expect. So I wrote a very long piece, which I do not expect you to have read because I was reading it last night. I was like, damn, this piece is long. It's a book. I wrote a long piece on Hannah Gadsby because Hannah Gadsby was all about trauma, as she put it, right? Trauma. And trauma somehow being the end of comedy, which was, again, a big farcical argument that she had. But that narrative as well allowed a lot of people, particularly queer people, to say, yes, see, this is how we feel. We're always traumatized by homophobic, gay bashing, queer bashing, and so on. Now, all of that does exist. But what do we do in a world where queerness is rapidly, and for all the best reasons, becoming part of the quote unquote normal? How long do we expect queers to define themselves constantly by that trauma narrative?
Yeah.
And what does it do to them psychologically?
I was thinking about that in terms of like Mayor Pete.
Yes.
And here's like, because he doesn't have a trauma story to tell, right?
No. He's traumatized others in Afghanistan.
But it's like, but it's interesting how like white male, like
right.
rich gay guys aren't really gay anymore. They're not in that category. Like we've moved our attention, the focus of our attention goes to like transgender people of color, because there we can look at the trauma. Like in other words, as you're less and less traumatized, you become more, quote unquote, normal and mainstream, and we don't pay attention to you. And then, again, this is something entirely on the left. Like it feels like the more trauma, the more we have attention and affection for you. But it's not like, it doesn't really have the power that it should, if that makes sense. I mean, one of the things you point out is about the Me Too movement and sort of how, Me Too I think it came from a lot of different directions, but it sort of settled into this celebrity thing, sort of like celebrities coming forth, and the idea of like telling your story, urging all women to tell their story. And it feels like without a safety net or a support net or institutional net for that story, then what's the point? It's just we're just consuming the stories. And the idea of like a famous actress coming out and telling her story of trauma and sexual abuse and those sorts of things versus like a cashier at Dunkin' Donuts in the Bronx coming forward to tell her story are two very different things. I mean, I had a student in my classes at CUNY in New York City who was inspired. She was writing me emails about this. She was inspired by the Me Too movement to tell her story of sexual assault. And she went to the police about it, and the police told her, this is like an old story. There's no evidence. It doesn't matter. And she was enormously like emotionally wrecked, devastated by the idea that telling her story didn't mean anything. There was no impact. When she had watched a sort of movement among celebrities being celebrated, made documentaries about these brave women who had come forth and like transformed the world and been heroes. She found the limits of that in her own life, and because of her economic and social situation, it didn't matter at all. Like that, her trauma was meaningless. And I think that's one thing that you point out really well is sort of like how trauma has currency in some places and doesn't have currency in others.
Absolutely, yes. Two things about that particular story. One is that there's that book by the two New York Times reporters, which is about the whole Me Too movement and how these are the two women who did all the reporting and created that entire long series, etc. And at the end of that book, they obviously throughout the book talk to a lot of, especially the celebrities and so on. They talk to Gwyneth Paltrow and so on. At the end of the book, they write about this meeting that they had in Gwyneth Paltrow's beach house somewhere. And so you have all these women, all these very famous celebrity women who came forward. I can't remember all the names, but there was one woman who was a McDonald's worker. And she was the one woman who said, none of this has changed anything for me. Because, and this is true, at McDonald's, you're still going to have women being harassed, sexually harassed or otherwise by their bosses. There is no way for them to get any justice, any recourse. They'll either be kicked out, and they can't afford to take a stand and leave these crappy jobs because the crappy jobs are all that they have, sometimes with insurance, right? So for those women, Me Too has made absolutely no difference, which is a startling fact that your student, unfortunately, had to learn firsthand. The second point about that is, I'm going to assume that CUNY has no health insurance that provides mental health care resources for women like your student.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure, but I would. I'm assuming that's true because I mean, mental health and getting access to like just therapy. I
Mhm.
love that. I love that meme that's always. I don't know if you see this on Twitter. That like men will do this instead of going to therapy. You know, men will do all these things instead of going to therapy. And it's like, well, why is the assumption that you can just go to therapy? Like, where does that come
Right.
from? Because I remember struggling with all sorts of. I'll get into my own trauma here.
Yeah.
Struggling with all kinds of things like anxiety and panic attacks and depression when I was in my 20s and having no. I mean, I wasn't going to
Mhm.
school. I had no health insurance. I had no way to get therapy. I mean, I was naive enough to think that you just go apply for this and they'll give it to you. But you find that there are real limits to that, and yeah, I
Absolutely.
think that's true.
Yeah.
So yeah, the
The best
idea
you
of
can get is someone who, they'll send you to some psychotherapist or whatever the name is these days, and they'll stuff you with medications,
right,
which then start you on different cycles. And I'm not saying that medications are absolutely not to be prescribed. A lot of people do benefit, but medications should be part of a long-term
yeah,
psychoanalytic regimen, as it were. When I was in grad school, we had free therapy, which benefited many of us for, and it was, I believe it was unlimited, etc. And then they cut it drastically. And that
hmm
was, I would say, early 90s is when that slide actually began. So
so that
now you
yeah,
get
so
medicated, you don't get therapy. You don't get psychoanalysis, you don't get therapy.
So that discourse in pop culture that's encouraging women especially to stand up, be brave, tell your story, don't remain silent. It's kind of like useless if it has no
Absolutely.
like it's acting like there's like going to be this loving embrace when it's really only special people get to enact their trauma and get rewards from it, if that makes sense. And you see that really in the college admissions thing, right? Like who are the minorities who get lifted up into elite private schools? They are the ones who are able to write a story of trauma and enact it in a way that is kind of like, okay, now you deserve to be here. You deserve to be here because you've gone through something. Yeah, it gets really down to like the idea of like you are a minority in this country if you are traumatized, and if you are not, then you're not, and
You're
that's
not, right. Amanda Gorman is an
disturbing.
excellent, right, right.
Yeah,
Amanda
Amanda
Gorman
Gorman. Yeah.
is an excellent example of someone who wields her, her various kinds of traumas on a national stage and is obviously making a lot of money and more prestige off all of that. And she probably will one day, as she wants to, become the president of the United States. I have no doubt about that, in a fantastic yellow Prada coat, no less. But I think that reminds me also that another place, another venue where you see this utilization of trauma is in the world of art, and especially, for instance, in the world of spoken word. I
Mm.
have, for many years, for over 20 years now, I have railed and railed and railed against spoken word. I think the damn thing needs to be demolished. I think that whole enterprise just needs to end because, and again, spoken word has been for a long time a big thing in Chicago. It's actually one of the sort of central places where it developed. And it is always about yanking young Black women and men, mostly in their teens, onto a stage, having them do, again, this is all minstrelsy, right? Onto a stage in front of mostly white people to talk about my experience in the ghetto. And I'm always reminded of that ghastly, weird Elvis Presley song, in the ghetto.
Oh God, yeah.
It's cringe inducing. And I know it's going to be an earworm for me all of today. So that's terrible. But, this idea of the Black person, right, as a pathology,
And
as
and
a symptom.
it's kind of. I mean, I went to the New Eurekan a couple times in New York, which is the sort of mecca of slam poetry and spoken word. Yeah,
I'm
it's
gagging.
it's amazing that it still goes on. Because I remember going there, and I went there in like 2005 or something, and I was looking around the room like, what the fuck? I thought that this was over. This like way of speaking in
Yeah.
which I say, his white hand came to me, and I felt disgrace. Like this sort of like real. I mean, they're all the poems sound the same. They have the same sort of
Yes.
rhythm to them.
Yes.
And yeah, I mean, I remember actually sending a couple of NYU students over there and saying, "You should go check that out." And I thought that I was sending them because I thought they would, kind of see how silly or dated it was. But they loved it. They thought like, "Wow, I want to get up on stage and say
Sure.
that." And it's sort of like a way. It is like a way to be a rock star for a moment. And I remember being sort of struck by how all of the poems were about trauma in one way or another, about like the experience of being abused, raped, etc. It kind of reminds me of the vagina monologues as
Oh
well.
God.
If you
Yes.
remember,
Oh dear, kitties. Yes,
I'm
I
sure,
remember the fucking vagina monologues.
which
yes.
I was subjected to as well. And you got to understand, like I was a young white male, like very. I think I found my politics through guilt. You know what I mean? Like because I went to the vagina monologues, I went to slam poetry, and I realized, and for me it was like I didn't have any way to critique this. I was sort of like, wow, like women and people of color are in front of me singing their suffering, and I am feeling like this is important, and this is something that no one else pays attention to. But it feels like that template of sort of singing your suffering became even more mainstream in the years after the 90s. But I blame the 90s for a lot of this shit. Is what I'm saying.
The 90s are to blame for so much. Remember Take Back the Night rallies?
Oh, yeah,
of course. And that was the same thing. Again, women, right, marching literally and singing, as you say, off their traumas. But this business of spoken word and of young Black people feeling that is a way for them, yes, exactly, to become a rock star is also linked to, again, the systemic issues that trauma is connected to. And in this case, it's connected to the whole apparatus of education and how education constantly marginalizes Black students in particular, not Asian people. Let me just, so there's a way in which Black students within the university system are seen as not deserving of high critique or even of demands. And I saw that a lot as someone who taught first at Purdue, which is a mostly white, very upper middle class, institution. And then I moved to UIC, which has a ton of Black and brown and Asian first generation college students, for instance. And I saw how people responded differently, especially to the young Black students, where the feeling was generally, well, they come out of these shitty schools. We really shouldn't expect much from them. So let's have all of them just write personal essays, for instance, right? And I remember this one person whom I will name one day, but for now I won't, but he's an extraordinarily wealthy lefty guy. And he happens to be on all the boards of everything that you can think about in Chicago. And he showed up at this meeting I was at, and he said something like, I was talking to a CPS principal, and he was so mad at me because I said to him, students shouldn't have to learn Shakespeare. Public school students shouldn't have to learn Shakespeare. They should just be able to do spoken word. And I wanted to scream at him, but I couldn't for reasons I can't explain right now. But what I wanted to say to him was, motherfucker, you have never attended anything but a private school from the time you were in kindergarten. He's extraordinarily wealthy. He comes from a very wealthy family. And neither have any of your children, some of whom are very famous now as well.
Mm-hmm.
They all went to the lab school. And the lab school is where Obama's kids went to when they were in Hyde Park. So this is a white person of enormous privilege who, if his kids had ever had to listen to their teacher saying, we're going to stop learning Shakespeare. From now on, you will express yourself and do spoken word. He would have been the first parent to lead to to scream and shut down the whole lab school if that had happened to his kids. Because he knows perfectly well that learning Shakespeare or learning, literature with a capital L is important if you want to break the rules. I always used to tell my students, look, you can break all the rules you want, but first you've got to learn them, right? So master grammar, accept the fact that grammar is a fucking Western construct, whatever, it's a white patriarchal construct, whatever. But if I, as an instructor, as a teacher, want you to succeed in this world, I need you to know what the base rules are. I do not want you to go out into the world and be fucking breaking rules and not know what the hell you're doing, or not be able to respond to someone who says you're breaking this essential rule. You need to know what the rules are in order to break them, period, right? But also, I don't see, I mean, we could go on. That's a whole other conversation. But I guess, about education and how Black students in particular are deeply marginalized by a lot of, lefties, white lefties in particular, who want to make themselves feel good because, look, we've inspired the ghetto boy to speak his own language. But that's a whole other conversation. But the bigger conversation here I want to have is about how trauma in this situation, in an educational situation especially, becomes yet another way to not give young Black students in particular the tools that they really need to survive.
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, I saw this across the board with, for instance, undocumented Latina students, for instance, right, who became the poster children for the undocumented movement. And they were at UIC and all their professors were rah-rahing them on. I know for a fact that several of these people can't write research papers on their own today because they were never asked to, they were never told to, they never had those demands made on them, right? Instead, their trauma stories, one of them actually, I think, wrote an entire thesis on her own story. And I remember thinking, what fucking research techniques do you need to write about your own story? So this is another way, I think, again, for me, the emphasis around trauma has always been, it's a terrible it's a terrible way to make people vomit out their personal details, yes, but it's also yet another way in which a neoliberal structure again reifies and reinforces the inequalities that are persistent, and it continues to make them even more persistent.
Right. It normalizes that as an experience that these people have, and it's like an ontology of that. It's like it's you're not a minority unless you've suffered, and so it kind of like it's a piece of segregation in a lot of ways, because it basically says, these are the people that are treated differently because they're in a different category. And it's not equal. Like, I mean, not all traumas are equal, right? Yeah. I mean, who gets to claim their trauma and who doesn't is something really important, I think. I mean, one of the things that's kind of been in the news the last several years are these cases of like I'm thinking about the Olympics girls, the girls who
Simone Biles.
Right, and this congressional testimony where it's just
I'm so glad you bring this up.
Insanely graphic congressional testimony, and I'm really compelled by that, in part, like listening to these girls who are like, look, the point of this is not the trauma. The point of this for us is the fact that no one did anything about it, and that it was our trauma didn't mean anything to the institutions that we reported it to. But I'm also thinking about like the Boy Scouts. I mean, the Boy Scout thing, 60,000. They said that the numbers are 60,000 young, mostly white boys were raped by Boy Scout troop leaders over the course of decades. And where do their stories fit into this? Right, you know what I mean? Like, where do their stories fit in? Because it does seem like, we expect certain people to be traumatized and always be in that category. But then you have like all these like white men obviously walking around the society with with this trauma, but they don't really have a place to enact it in a way that has currency. In other words, like, we are locating trauma as an experience of minorities, and that to me is like insane. It's insanely racist because it's expecting that that's what the minority experience is. And at the other end of it, you have a bunch of raped white men who have nothing to do with their trauma, like nowhere to put it. And that part is really interesting to me. It's really sticky territory because the left seems like it has a way of honoring certain traumas and sort of ignoring others.
And I think with the Olympians, as I recall, some of them were white as well.
Oh,
or
yeah.
were they all mostly African? Yeah. But it's also about gender in that sense, right?
Yes.
So how we think about what masculinity can sustain somehow, for some reason, right? Somehow men can just And I've actually had people say this to me when I would talk about sexual trauma. They would say, well, boys can take it. No, what the fuck do you mean boys can take it? That's ridiculous. How do you expect an 8-year-old, 10-year-old, 15-year-old, 16-year-old, 7? I don't care how old they are. What the fuck do you mean but the men can take it? No one can. That as if somehow gender alone helps them, externalize.
Well, I'll just throw war veterans in there.
I was just thinking about it because of
right?
your book, and I know that you've encountered many war veterans in your work, right? Who have, we can talk about the definition of PTSD, for instance, but also the sexual harassment that men endure in the army that they cannot talk about. Mm-hmm. I've often talked about the fact, for instance, that in immigration, we often talk, and as we should, about the fact of rapes at the border. What we don't want to talk about is I've always thought, well, this is very gendered, but I have no doubt that many men are also raped. Mm-hmm. Because are you trying to tell me that somehow, they're somehow immune to all of that? So that's one thing, which is this idea of the burden on masculinity. But also, when I listened to all the Olympians talk about their treatment at the hands of coaches and the fact that no one was listening, including, I believe, as I recall, the FBI and so on. Here's the thing that I have consistently wondered. I have not yet wondered it out aloud, except today, which is, well, yes, but what about the societal pressure coming from parents and schools? Can you really tell me that someone like Nasser, the coach who abused, I think that's his name, who abused, generations of athletes for so many years, are you actually trying to convince me that somehow no one in this community knew what was going on, that the girls didn't talk among themselves, that some girls did not go to their parents and say, this is what he's doing to me, this is how he touches me, this is what he does to me? And my firm conviction is that a lot of the parents knew, a lot of the teachers knew, a lot of the authorities knew, and the pressure went back on the girls to be silent about this until it blew up. And now it's blown up in a way that places the blame entirely on him. And of course, he's to be blamed. Of course, he's a horrible rapist and pedophile, all of that. Yes, of course, he's horrible. But the system kept him going for that many years.
It's Harvey Weinstein, right? I mean...
Yes, exactly. No one wants to talk about the systems that keep these men going.
Everybody knew what Harvey Weinstein was up to. Everybody knew that. Absolutely. I mean, they all admit it now. I mean, they were admitting it at the time. If you watch those clips of the Oscars, it's like Oscar ceremony after Oscar ceremony for years. People are making jokes about I'm going to hell because I work with Harvey Weinstein. Harvey Weinstein's the devil. Everyone seemed to know this. And at the same time, the pressure does go back on the victim to be this is the culture of how, to me, it's Hollywood and Olympic gymnastics are great examples because they're both these theaters of the body in which the bodies are already expected to be on display, pushed to their limits, and subjects of intense eroticism, right?
Absolutely.
So Larry Nassar and Harvey Weinstein are, the way I read it is that these cultures have kind of found ways to normalize that and be that's just, an ugly byproduct of the fact that of what we're doing here. And you're right. That's the conversation no one wants to have. We want to make it about Harvey Weinstein or Larry Nassar and not see that the sort of template of these performances and these institutions have created the possibility for everyone to ignore this awful trauma. And then and then it comes out as this sort of post, when it's all over, we all then wring our hands and say, oh, how terrible it all is. But I can only assume that all of this stuff continues.
It continues, and it will continue as long as we have a system say, for instance, gymnastics, where it's grueling as hell. It is hell on your body. It literally breaks your body from a very young age. Absolutely, it's torture. But if you make it, the payoff is huge. So you have these parents, many of whom are middle class, because you also have to have money to be able to put your daughter through this arduous ritual called gymnastics. So there's that. But the payoff for them potentially is huge. The same is true of Hollywood, right? You put your kid through all of this. When I was reading again, I had similar thoughts about Kevin Spacey and all this talk about the trauma visited upon young gay men. One of them was, I think he was underage. He was 16 or 17, and he was at this party past midnight. And forgive me, I don't mean to be auntie here, but I am thinking, what the fuck is a 16-year-old doing at a house party, thrown by a 50-year-old guy at fucking midnight?
Yeah, and there's just like coke everywhere.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it's insane.
And I'm like, where are the parents? This is the kind of question that you only expect the right to ask, of course, which is, where are the parents? But I think we on the left also have to start saying, are we really paying attention to children in our midst? Are we instead saying that we can't say things like, where were the parents? And I want to ask that. I want to say, where were the parents? Well, my guess is it's the same with Michael Jackson. You have these parents now basically
starstruck, absolutely starstruck.
Oh yes, I mean, he took him into the West Wing, and I was in the East Wing, and I'm sitting here thinking, really?
They tell a story in that Michael Jackson documentary. I watched the whole thing, and I had similar reaction. And part of the reason I was like, I wanted to have this conversation with you, Yasmin, is because I was like, it's hard not to sound like a reactionary or sound like you're like carrying water for the right. Because this is what the right says. I mean, this is the stuff that how they react to AOC is with a big jerk off motion and like whatever, eat shit AOC, and like that's not what we're saying. I think we're more saying like for our team on the left, like what are we doing with this, with this trauma thing? Because in the Michael Jackson documentary, they have like these parents who are like, they tell a story of Michael Jackson coming to their house because he was like depressed and alone, and he's kind of like had no friends. And they're like, yeah, he came to our house and he started sleeping in the bed with our son when he was 14. And we just thought, well, it's kind of amazing that Michael Jackson is in our house. And, we were just kind of like into it. And and it's just kind of like, what the fuck? Like, how is that?
Right?
Like his celebrity makes it okay for him to sleep with your kid? Like it's fucking insane and weird. And it sounds like victim blaming or something. But part of me the whole time was like, Hollywood parents, man, they are pimping their kids out from the very beginning. So
that's the word.
Let's not be surprised.
That's the word. And the other thing I always think about with regard to Michael Jackson, of course, is that, as we all know and suspect, I think we may not want to talk about it too much, but Michael Jackson had to also have been a victim of abuse. And I think there have been stories in the past about what his childhood was like. I mean, you had the Jackson 5, but he was the Jackson. He had that voice, right? So, I mean, I think the family knew right away. The kid opened his mouth and you knew right away, this kid is going to be it. This kid is going to define music for generations. And that only comes along. I mean, I know we're not supposed to talk about things like genius, but frankly, there are people, you just look at them or you listen to them and you go, you know what, this kid has it. And I think I have no doubt that he was also pushed to the limits. I have no idea about what he may have been pushed to do as a child around studio executive. We don't know. I mean, but more than anything else, even if there was no quote unquote, physical and sexual abuse, it has to be profoundly alienating to be that young a child and become a superstar. Mm-hmm. And to have no idea of how to have friends. And you have his fame, so that's a whole other, speaking about trauma, the trauma of celebrity alone that's visited upon people who have gained celebrity at a very young age. Some of them escape it. Someone like Jodie Foster, for instance, seems to have done well, mainly because she had this mother who seems to have been very, protective, perhaps. But again, this is all, of course, me looking at all of this from the outside. I don't know, but it seems like she's sustained a whole.
But she's the rare story. I mean,
she's the rare story.
It's a cliche that child actors and child stars.
Absolutely,
their situation is awful. And it's one that it seems like emerges entirely from the idea that their bodies and faces and voices have value to adults who are going to exploit that in every way imaginable. I mean, it's a really intense sight of
It
understanding
is.
capitalism, because it's
It
like
is.
they're a commodity from the time,
They
and they don't
are.
really understand that. I mean, there's no way they can understand that. And like the Michael Jackson documentary, watching like all these like kids try to like be like him is so and
It
like
is
get on
bizarre.
stage with him is so scary and
It
disturbing,
is. It
because it's
is.
like they're desperate to get what they think of as
Mm-hmm.
affection. It seems like
Mm-hmm.
affection, but it's really commodification, you
It
know.
is absolutely, absolutely. And so that's what's interesting to me about trauma, which is on the one hand, trauma is how one gains success for, for some people, for instance, okay, so spoken word or Me Too movement, celebrityhood, etc. That's how you gain material success in some ways. But trauma is also what you are compelled to endure in order then to get anything like financial success. So you have the
Mm,
gymnast, for instance, being pushed into the system. You have child actors. Jodie Foster was the original Coppertone child, as I
that's
recall.
right. Yeah.
And there's really weird. I mean, it is really hard to look at that ad these days. It's of a tiny child, maybe 3 years old, whose knickers are being
Yeah.
pulled down by a dog. It is the
Super fucked up.
weirdest
Yeah, it's
fucked up
so sick.
child porn out there. So you have this human being who becomes famous at that moment, becomes actually the breadwinner for her family. Her mother was a single mom. She had a brother. I mean, that Jodie Foster's salary, starting from when she was about 3 years old, was what sustained that family, right? So you have this way in which that we don't want to think
Oh
about the ways
God.
in which, right? I know it's gross. I can't really look at that image anymore. But the ways in which people are traumatized by systems that suck the life out of them, as with the gymnasts. And we continue to do that with our fetishization of gymnastics and
Mm-hmm.
all of this. Oh, Simone Biles is GOAT. She's the greatest of all athletes, blah, blah, blah. We fetishize that. And then we also make it possible for people to gain fame through enacting their trauma. So, I mean, I'm extremely cynical about Amanda Gorman, but there's a part of me that's also sympathetic, because I
Of
think to
course.
myself, here you are this relatively attractive young Black woman. You have overcome obstacles, and you have no choice but to be a really shitty poet and to
Well,
relive your trauma.
well,
I mean,
I'm glad you brought up being affected by it, because I mean, part of I think what we're trying to intervene on is like how powerful this is and how it like sucks the air out of the room. Like if someone stands up at like a group meeting and starts talking about their rape experience, the room goes silent, right? It's just kind of like, where do we go from
Mhm.
here? And it's enormously moving often. I mean, I think I told the story to Freddie DeBoer last week. We were talking about how when I was young, because I got caught with weed a bunch of times, I got sent to like these AA meetings and NA meetings. And I mean, those are places that are entirely like a group of people
Yes.
sitting in a circle, just vomiting out horrific stories. I mean, I still remember a lot of the stories that were told there. And in fact, like it's a well known within recovery culture that there are like stars of AA that like people look to, like, oh, is Bob going to be there tonight? Because if Bob's not there, I don't want to go, because Bob tells the best stories, right? And like these stories that I remember of just unbelievable abuse and depravity that comes from alcoholism and drug addiction, prostitution. It was sort of the point of these meetings, right? Was like kind of getting that out, but also scared straight, right? Like the rest of us are supposed to hear these stories and say, thank you, Robert. Like, thank you for telling us this, because it like gave something to us. It's an important mover of people. And
Mhm.
I brought up movies earlier. I think about like movies about slavery are all about whippings and rape, right? Like
Yes, yes.
every slavery movie has like a long whipping scene, because then we know it's a slavery movie. Like slavery is whipping. Whereas like if you read about slavery, it's a really dynamic, complicated historical experience. But we have reduced it to just the physical trauma. I mean, even a
Mhm,
movie like
mhm,
12 Years a Slave
mhm,
is
mhm,
like, it has like the big whipping scene at the end. The woman in that movie that goes through all the sexual assaults and all the
mhm, mhm,
whippings,
mhm.
she's the one that like I remember the most about the movie, right? Like I'm talking
Right.
about just from a pure like archetypal Joseph
Mhm,
Campbell
mhm.
storytelling thing. This shit has intense power, and that's part of I think what you and I are talking about here is like its intense power is so powerful that it can be it can be intensely manipulative because it's so like shatters your ability to really critique it. It's just kind of like you absorb the trauma and that's that.
Right. I mean, there's a reason why we talk about trauma porn. There is and I say that as someone who strongly supports porn, but there is a pornographic impulse, even to watching and to remembering, no matter who you, and this doesn't mean that you support the trauma that's being inflicted upon the person, but there is something that wakes up certain impulses in you when you're watching that. There's that. And then there is the idea of authenticity, which is to say you are not X if you cannot recall your trauma. You know, in immigration circles, we all know this, for instance, that everyone will talk about, oh, well, if so-and-so is about to be deported, let her or him get refugee or asylee status. Now, first of all, those two things are very different, but that's a whole other conversation. But the issue there is a lot of good lawyers will tell people who want to apply, they'll say, you know, this is going to make you relive your trauma in terrible ways because they will make you relive it in excruciating detail. Not only that, we know of judges, for instance, who have actually looked at, for instance, gay asylees and said, well, you don't seem gay enough and you don't seem to have been traumatized enough. So there's a way in which trauma always has to play into an unknown register of authenticity. And as a woman of color, for instance, I'm just going to bring myself into this conversation, but as a woman of color who has who has, I think, written maybe one or two essays that can be counted as personal, I know the cost that I've paid over and over again for not retelling what people hope will be my narrative of trauma, right? Because
make yourself real to us.
Right.
Like how much can you be an immigrant if you haven't? Right.
So I'm seen as inauthentic because I have not reenacted my trauma in public life. How dare I not? And then when I do, on the rare occasions that I have, I've been slammed for it because obviously that just doesn't happen. Okay, you can't win either way. And I didn't do it in a cynical fashion. I did it to say, actually, this is who I am and this is how this affects me. But that doesn't matter because if you are an immigrant and a brown woman and a queer woman, none of that matters unless your story is of deep abjection. So unless I can relate a story about being raped in public or something as drastic as that, I'm not going to be seen as an authentic subject. So there's a way in which authenticity, your subjecthood is authenticated by not just any trauma. It has to be a very particular kind of trauma. There's a notion of authenticity. And then I think, yes, the financial systems, my stories, my analysis of neoliberalism, which fucking kicks ass, cannot be plugged into the writing and publishing industrial complex. It's not profitable enough.
Right,
I mean, I'm fine with that. I don't want to, but I don't want to play in that particular playground. But there's a reason why trauma is also about storytelling, which is a whole other story, right? Which is about narrativizing as opposed to theorizing. So even in literary theory, as you know, especially in the United States, quite literally in literary theory, for instance, if you look at departments of critical theory, you'll notice that most of them are men. You don't see a lot of women, and you don't see a lot of women of color because and I know this as someone who was once applying for theory jobs, they don't know what to do with a woman, especially a woman of color, who isn't just talking about her trauma or her narratives about immigration. So women theorists who are of color have a very hard time finding jobs in critical theory, at least in this country.
Interesting.
For that reason,
right? Because it's like you expect like a level of sentiment and emotion.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah.
I had that happen to me during one of my drafts. I remember when I was in grad school. And this was a draft, and I had written something, which I won't detail, but it had to do with a personal story. And I recall, one of my a woman and a lesbian and a white woman who wanted me to write that much more. She said to me, that story, that's what you should expand on.
That's who you are.
Right. You have no analysis that's worthy of our reading. We don't want to read your analysis. We just want you to constantly perform your trauma. And that happens to a lot of people, a lot of women, a lot of people of color, a lot of men of color. There are these complicated ways. If you are writing about class, even as a white man, you have to always perform this narrative about your working class background.
Right.
In very affective, sentimental ways. And you have to get past that before you can hold yourself
I remember
up.
Daddy coming home from the
Yes.
factory. Yeah.
My mama was a restaurant waitress.
Right.
It's like a fucking country song,
Yeah.
And I say this with great respect for country and western.
but the more you can access that, the more you have a story to tell. And to me, like, I always thought of it as kind of like, because I thought to myself, well, if I don't have a traumatic story to tell, then I'm not special in any way. I'm just like a white dude. I got to invent something interesting about me in order to get a scholarship or something, right? Like, that seems like that's the direction of things. I wonder, you're a Chicago person, Yasmin. How much do we blame Oprah for a lot of this? Because it feels like, you're talking about the 90s and you're talking about like race and certain attitudes about women, etc. I remember that show being a show not unlike the AA meetings I went to, where like a lot. I mean, Oprah herself, her story is one of rape and racism and family abuse and poverty. I mean, her story has it all, honestly. Like, she's from like Mississippi, and I almost get the idea that, like, I associate Oprah Winfrey with slavery, weirdly enough, because she was like, she's in The Color Purple, she's in the film Beloved, and she very much seems like she's kind of the carrier of the trauma of the experience in some way. I know that Oprah has a decades-long career, and she's gone through a lot of different. I mean, I feel like Dr. Phil was a way to like bring this to like white people. The same sort of idea that we like share our trauma together, and that sort of like gives this show its narrative qualities, but also its qualities of like healing and things like that. It seems like that Oprah thing kind of made a leap into politics in a much more pronounced way, and that's part of what your AOC piece is about.
Absolutely. And it is no surprise or coincidence that Oprah's biggest audience is white women.
Right.
Suburban white women.
This is some Uncle Tom's Cabin shit, right?
Yeah. Women who will not come to Chicago. Except maybe to go to Macy's when Macy's was still around, and when we did things like shop in actual stores, right? But her primary demographic is suburban white women,
right?
And that is, I think, critical to understanding Oprah. And she has masterfully walked this line between being authentic Black woman, so she resurrects stories of trauma, or she even I don't know if she resurrects them or invents them or whatever, right? But she brings up a story of trauma whenever it's convenient, when it's necessary. She'll suddenly revert to oppressed Black woman. But her major story arc, right? The reason why she's so successful is because she holds out the promise of immense neoliberal wealth. That's Oprah's story. And the moments that ruptures is when what she relates as trauma. Her traumas now have moved from, because how much more can you talk about? I was raped, I had a child, right? I think the child was buried or something, all those details. How often can you relay those? Well, now her trauma is of being extraordinarily wealthy and being stopped in her tracks, as for instance, when she went to an MS shop in Paris and was disallowed from entering because I think the shop was actually closing or something. But those are her trauma stories now, which is to say, how is it possible that I, one of the richest Black women in the world, one of the richest women, period, in the world, am being stopped from buying a I think she wanted a $75,000 bag. And they said to her, well, you can't afford that. You should have a $38,000 bag. I mean, it's a world of which the economics of which I do not claim to understand. But there she is. But that's her trauma now, right? That's her filtration. That's her filter now, which is, I am enormously successful. I'm an enormously successful Black woman. I am proof that to be Black does not mean that you cannot be successful. And that's what her suburban audience uses as an example. If Oprah can do it, having come from all of this trauma here in Mississippi, if Oprah can do it, anyone can do it. Anyone should be able to do it. So I think that's a really interesting way. And I'm glad you brought her up because, I think that's exactly how she has fashioned trauma to her advantage, where she is who she is now. She's sort of like the queen. I'm actually writing about her in relation to, for a long overdue piece, I might add, into this book, Caste by Isabel Wilkerson. And it's interesting to me to listen to these two women talk to each other in an interview and how they kind of throw this ball of trauma back and forth. And for them at this point, the biggest trauma is not being allowed to enjoy their wealth. Which, first of all, let me just say, if you're a black person,
that does sound traumatic.
Yeah. And to be fair, and I say this as someone who is a woman of color who has often had the same experience in various stores and so on, it is humiliating. But even I will say, yes, it's humiliating, but it's part of it. That this is not it, right? I mean, that's not trauma. It's destabilizing. It's racist. It's about inequality. Yes, I can fight it on different levels, but not on the level of trauma. But I think for these two women in this conversation that they had about the book on caste, that was clearly their biggest problem. It wasn't centuries of racial oppression. In fact, Wilkerson wants to erase that trauma of slavery. That's what caste is all about, it's about saying, race and racism are no longer useful templates. Like, what the fuck is that? Have we ended race and racism? No. But her logic is, let's use caste to wipe out that sense of trauma and to reimagine ourselves as these classed individuals. So that's, I think Oprah is fascinating and will continue to be fascinating. Well, maybe. I don't know how well she's doing now that she's mostly on Apple TV, whatever the fuck. I mean, I have Apple TV, but I don't know what
the damage has been done,
Yes, exactly.
It's also kind of like, I don't know, reacting to the Capitol riot, right? The insurrection, whatever you want to call that. For politicians, it's not just AOC. It's like you see these cops, like these officers, like testifying and crying in front of Congress and saying I can't sleep after this. And I mean, there were a number of cops who committed suicide. So like was it six, something like that.
Maybe 3 of them committed suicide, which is terrible, right?
So we know that trauma is real, but I'm also kind of like, what is the efficacy of sharing it? Because what it does is it sort of crystallizes, I guess, the liberal side to be like, look what happened to us. This is important, and it's important because people were traumatized. But the right's reaction isn't going to be anything to that. So in other words, we don't move the dial anywhere, and we don't prevent another January 6th by dwelling upon the details of how hurt we were by it, if that makes sense. And I don't deny the necessity of like kind of sharing who was hurt and why. But at the same time, I'm thinking like, well, what does this do for us?
Yeah,
like, it obviously has currency on the left, like it, but to the right, it actually seems to like fuel them. Like and there is a vampiric. I'm glad you brought up trauma porn, because there is a vampiric need to consume the trauma. But I think that the right and left consume it in different ways, and that part of it is important.
And in many ways, I think our overuse of trauma anesthetizes us to trauma, because what we're saying is, it's not trauma unless you relay it over and over again in these drastic terms. So when I was watching the riots happen, I won't say traumatized, but I was horrified, for instance, by the sight and sound of one of the guards who was trapped in that revolving door.
Yes.
And who kept screaming, help, help, help. Yeah. And it was horrifying. And I listened to him, give testimony later. But I just remember this guy, and, also I think he was young as well, and one of the rookier sort of security guards out there. And it was dreadful. And my attitude towards all of this is, listen, people, if you're not traumatized by what happened, then who the fuck are you? Why do you need this to be retold in particular ways? And I think the ways in which then it became a story about their trauma rather than what are the conditions that led to this, that I think that sort of flipping over, right? That constructing and the narrativizing of trauma anesthetizes us to the conditions that lead to that trauma in the first place. So what the hell is going on in this country? This country which is literally built on centuries of genocide and slavery. And that's the history that I think that we are ignoring and anesthetizing ourselves to. We're forgetting it. And so it allows us to say, oh, well, the 6th was all about Trump and these racist people who showed up, etc. No, the 6th was all about this country's history just bursting forth yet again, as was
Right.
September 11, as was name any fucking historical quote unquote trauma that you want to relay, right? And you've talked to, war veterans. You know how complicated those stories are, especially when you've talked to people who were drafted. So that's a whole other, right, set of narratives of, I know a lot of World War II veterans who were like, I didn't want to fucking go. I hated it. And what I saw traumatized me. What I had to do traumatized me. And that's the narrative that no one wants to talk about. That for many soldiers, especially of that period, what they had to do to survive to other human beings is actually what the trauma was all about.
Yeah. And that, again, sort of as it comes out in the body of the veteran, it has a very different sort of tone than when we think about other groups of people. God, I'm thinking about growing up, and I mean they still do it with animals. Because you and I talk about animals a lot, right?
Yes.
But these commercials where they show like tortured animals and animals that have been abused, and they sort of like they're meant to like key into like this deep emotion about seeing suffering. And they do it with when growing up. I mean, Ethiopian children, with flies on their face, starving kids that you could sponsor. If you like send $5 a month, you can sponsor this kid and give him a little bit. And there was no context for any of it. It's all just sort of like the idea is that these puppies or these little African kids are always going to be in this situation, but you can help them out a little bit if you send this NGO some money. Is like a part of what we're talking about here, because it seems like there's the consumption of the trauma and activation of an emotion for some response, but no kind of acknowledgement of how the context of the whole political and social situation is creating this shit in the first place.
Right.
They're just meant to they're always going to be there. They're always going to be suffering. Yeah.
Right. And if you're the suburban white kid, the fact that you want a golden retriever to gallop around your pristine lawn in your suburban, house, right, that your father takes care of every weekend. That's why those puppies are dying. Right. Because those puppies are being crafted literally in puppy mills because of your unending desire, your family's unending desire for the suburban lifestyle. That's the link. But no, ignore all of that. You're not asked to think about all of that. Just give $5 to, after having watched this puppy die. It's
GoFundMe now. I mean, that's what's so tragic about it, actually, is like, if you look at like GoFundMe, we talk about this, like where people get healthcare, right?
I know.
And what do? They like make a GoFundMe in which they include pictures on and share it on social media of their baby with tons of tubes coming out of the baby. And they say, like, look at this. In other words, there's this feeling of like, show me the suffering and I will, pay out of it. I don't know what that is. It's like a paying off your guilt or something. But the fact that like that's a template of people trying to get healthcare in this country is by going on a social media site and displaying their pain and suffering so that people will feel guilty or people will feel some emotion and give money to try and like alleviate that feeling. That's incredibly disturbing to me, because it's something you see everywhere. That's kind of like the way you put it is the kind of like cry for us, dance for us, and we'll throw nickels at you kind of thing. Yeah. It works, and it's something that you're to see it like engaged by like Democrats as they're trying to like craft a response to rising fascism in the country. Is freaky to me, because it's just kind of like, we're going to have GoFundMes of people that have been beaten up by fascists. Look what the fascists did to me, instead of like addressing the larger problem that there's fascists in the country, if that makes sense. Yeah, absolutely.
No, absolutely. It has to be systems, not trauma, not narratives, but we are so embedded in the search for constantly searching for the perfect narrative of trauma. That's the American way, it seems.
I'm thinking about Lars von Trier movies now. Those like Dancer in the Dark with Bjork, and I mean, this guy's early career was entirely like banking on the idea that like the more you show suffering, the more sentiment is produced, the more storytelling value there is, and it is part of like trauma porn. The sort of there's a real need for people to see each other suffer, it feels like, and consume it in some way. I'm really glad you brought up the Oprah's audience is all like, white people and like middle class white women, because it seems like that's the target audience for a lot of this is like there's a heart that we can somehow reach with this stuff, but it also just reinforces all the same inequalities.
Absolutely. Yeah. Oh, and Oprah, yes, I agree with you. Oprah can and should be blamed for a lot of this. I'm with you.
Yeah, we're gonna have to do a larger investigation of Oprah, because I remember watching it so much when I was young, and I really like. I look at it now with a lot of critique and a lot of like the same kind of ideas that you're throwing out here. But when I was young, I was just transfixed by it, and
all of us were.
Yeah.
And also, it was on a different schedule. Remember, those were the days when we actually waited with bated breath for the next episode, as opposed to now where you just binge everything. So I think there's that as well, that shift, that fundamental shift. And I think it was sort of like your weekly injection.
Yeah.
That you would carve time out for that, and you would wait and watch Oprah because you knew you wouldn't see it again for a really long time. And I think that structural anticipation had a lot to do as well. And I think that maybe, I don't think she's floundering. Oprah will be
She's fine. Yeah.
For the rest of her life, if she ever has grandchildren, which I don't think she will, but her great grandchildren would have been fine. She's fine in that way. But I think one of the reasons that my understanding is that her new episodes and series aren't what they used to be, because it's divorced from that particular structure, which is of constant anticipation of what will Oprah say. And what she had, I've been watching a lot of her book discussions, and they're really bad, and they don't carry over well post that show period.
She doesn't have the cultural influence that she once had, it seems like, but she's a billionaire, so she's going to be president. I think the most recent thing was her interview of the royal of Harry and Meghan.
Yes,
right?
That was the big. You're right. That was the big cultural moment. Yes.
Yeah, and look at what it was about. It was about like Meghan's trauma, essentially, of dealing with the royal family, which I don't deny any of it. And it's part of like, I think why I'm so glad we had this conversation, Yasmin. We can wrap it up, but it's part of like what made me what I thought of as a progressive, or what headed me towards the left before I started reading like things like Chomsky and Howard Zinn, and actually getting into like the structural elements of capitalism and stuff like that. It was movies and TV about trauma that like really taught me that caring about other people's suffering, particularly the suffering of racial minorities or women or gay people. Movies like Philadelphia with Tom Hanks, Dead Man Walking, taught me that I should be against the death penalty, basically. And so, I think of those as sort of Uncle Tom's Cabins, in that they're aimed at white, sentimental, liberal hearts. And so I guess I'm saying that I recognize how powerful traumatic stories are to like moving the human heart. But without the second part of it, the like structural element of where this trauma is coming from, you're just left with stories of Tom Hanks or Tim Robbins or Sean Penn or whatever. You're just left with those sort of individual stories and not really recognizing the larger part of it. I don't know how we get to there, but it seems like the storytelling part of this is really undeniably powerful. And that's part of what I think you and I are trying to sort of intervene on a little bit, because it's not something that is going to go away. People are going to keep telling their stories of trauma, and the left are going to be the ones that really care about that. And that seems like something we should think about.
Absolutely. I think most of social justice today is impelled by this turn to trauma and impelled by this narrativization of trauma. And what I argue for, big shameless plug here in my book, Strange Love,
away.
is a form of heartlessness. What we need is less empathy. In fact, I'm against empathy. What we need is more of a heartlessness, in the sense that we believe in systems rather than making people feel. Feelings are to the detriment of anything that we want in terms of achieving justice and equality.
Yeah, I want to read this piece from your piece on AOC that I think is really great and gets at exactly what I'm talking about. You say, and you're talking about the squad here, Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib and AOC and a number of others, women of color in Congress who are in many ways sort of the leading edge of a lot of this stuff, for good and for bad. But you say this, so you say there are costs of placing such burdens on them and on any other politicians or public figures. It means that the issues they fight and stand for the most, like ending poverty and inequality, can only be fought for if they first prove how heartrending all of that is. If we cannot understand the horrors of war, poverty, illness, and assault of any kind in the abstract, surely that speaks to a depravity in our public life. If we cannot imagine what suffering feels like without making someone perform it for us over and over again, surely it's we who are the most inhumane and cruel, more so than those who inflicted the abuse in the first place, because we insist that the suffering becomes a permanent public display. What does it mean for the world we want if we cannot fight for the rights and dignity of other humans without first making them cry for us and without us crying over them? So well stated, Yasmin, and that was the reason why I wanted to talk to you today. And I will have those pieces linked in the episode description so everyone can go read them, because I think that you get into even more detail of some of the things we're hitting on in this conversation. But thanks as always. It's good. An hour always goes quick with you.
I know. And thank you so much again. It's always a deep pleasure. And I look forward to the next time. Thank you so much, David.
Thank you. Well, all right. I think that's going to do it for our trauma conversation, at least for now. I want to thank my guest, Yasmin Nair. Go check out her website and subscribe if you can, yasminnair.com. She is honestly doing some of the most adventurous stuff on the left. I don't know where I would be without her perspectives, honestly. So go check that out. Thanks so much for being a Nostalgia Trap listener. If you want to support our show and subscribe, you can do that at patreon.com/Nostalgia Trap. Lots of bonus stuff for our subscribers, including our movie club starting November 19th. Keep that in your calendar. Very much looking forward to that. Thanks so much, and we will talk to you soon. Bye-bye.